Hi, I'm John Goldsmith, and this is the second in a sequence of 10 videos that I'm making about the chapters in Battle in the Minefields, which is a book that I published in 2019, co-authored with a friend and colleague from the University of Paris, Wilhelm von Laks. Before going any further, let's take a look at the table of contents. We'll look first at Chapter 1 and then Chapter 2. In the first video, we discussed Chapter 1, and we talked about some of the material that's in that section. We talked a bit about liberation moments, this great feeling of liberation, of a weight having been taken off the shoulders of people who engaged as part of the vanguard of a new intellectual movement. We talked about the ways in which linguists for the last 200 years have viewed themselves as a part of science, although typically they thought they'd become a science only in the last 20 or 30 years. We talked a little bit about the world of ideas and the world of social relations. I'm going to come back to that. We talked about the concept of generations and how important that is for understanding our history. We didn't really talk about authority. I'll come back to that. We talked about the concept of a group identity, which turns out to be an important characteristic for understanding the concept of ideology, which I didn't get into. We didn't talk about Jehovah's problems and Noah's problem, which I'll certainly come back to at some point. There's a new story in there. We talked just a little bit about the fundamental and deep problem of materialism and causality, and the role that those notions play in developing a scientific account of human nature and of the mind. In Chapter 2, we talk about the rise of the growing importance of history and time in both the physical sciences and ultimately the sciences of humankind. We'll talk about the explosion of time from a scientific point of view over the course of the 19th century, and the rise of linguistics as an independent discipline. In a number of ways that are important for us, the 19th century was the century of time and of history. A famous French historian in the 19th century, Gabriel Monod, wrote the following: "The history of languages, the history of literature, the history of institutions, the history of philosophies, the history of religions, all of the studies which take man and the phenomena of the human spirit as their object have taken on a historical character. Our century is the century of history." If we go back to the 19th century, we see some radical changes in our understanding of the history of the universe, which is to say the solar system at that point, the history of the earth, the history of humanity, and the history of human languages as we knew them at the time. And these four changes were not unrelated, and they were all directly related, in fact, to the decline in the influence of the church and of the story told in the Christian Bible, especially in the Old Testament. And we can see the impact of the Christian view on these. I'll just mention a couple of cases. You may well know of the story of the Irish Bishop Ussher, who in 1650 published the results of his biblical computations, which told him that God had created the earth in 4004 BC, and that was a position that an educated person in the 19th century could still believe. In the early 1700s, the early 18th century, Gottfried Leibniz, the philosopher and scientist and mathematician, was interested in languages also, and set out to explore and come up with a set of hypotheses about how the languages of the world were related. And it was only natural at the time to take the descendants of Noah to be a natural way to divide up the human beings that we knew of. So we have a tradition which still remains with us a little bit today of naming language groups after the children of Noah. And there was Ham, and there was Shem, and there was Japheth. And we still talk about Hamitic languages and Semitic languages corresponding to Ham and Shem. We don't talk that much about Japhetic languages anymore, but even 100 years ago, people were using that term. Here is a map which, if you take a look at it, you can see divides the old world up into a Hamitic part, which is Africa. You see a Shem part, which is basically the southern part of Eurasia. And then you see a Japhetic part, which is in yellow and which is the northern part of Eurasia. And these are the children of Noah. This is a natural way in which biblical knowledge had an impact on how Europeans looked at their history. I mentioned a couple minutes ago that that the changes that we saw in the 19th century, and already very much in process at the beginning of the 19th century, included a different changes in our understanding of the time depth of the solar system, that is to say, the universe, of the Earth, of humanity, and even of human languages as they were known at the time. And I want to say a little bit more about the second, the Age of the Earth, which is the province of geology. And I want to focus on this for a moment, partly because we don't generally think all that much about geology today, and we don't remember that it really was the queen of the natural sciences at the beginning of the 19th century, both for theoretical reasons, that is to say, both because of the consequences for our worldview of the discoveries that were being made in geology, and also because of the practical consequences of the development of geology, which I'll come back to in a minute. William Whewell, whose name I mentioned in a previous video, was president of the Geological Society, and he wrote the following in 1833. He wrote, "I confess indeed, for my own part, I do not look to see the exertions of the present race of geologists surpassed by any who may succeed them. The great geological theorizers of the past belong to the fabulous period of the science, but I consider the eminent men by whom I am surrounded as the heroic age of geology. They have slain its monsters and cleared its wildernesses. They have founded here and there a great metropolis, a queen of future empires. They have exerted combinations of talents which we cannot hope to see often again exhibited, especially when the condition of the science which produced them is changed. I consider that it is now the destiny of geology to pass from the heroic to the historical period. She can no longer look for supernatural successes, but she is entering upon a career, I trust a long and prosperous one, in which she must carry her vigilance into every province of her territory and extend her dominion over the earth till it becomes far more truly than any before a universal empire." Wow, a little bit over the top, but he meant it. One of the things that's striking about geology is how visual it can be. And we can look, as in this picture, we can look at the history of the earth. If we just know how to understand what our eyes are showing us, people began to understand that these layers that they saw were the successive layers created by sedimentation, that each layer represented an earlier moment in time. And this understanding was deeply affected by the discovery of fossils of different ages in the different layers of the earth. This was called the study of stratigraphy. The layers were stratigraphical. And this led to a deep and very interesting idea, the concept of a stratigraphical column. As you can see in this picture here, you can imagine, and now we can actually do it, you can imagine diving down, drilling, so to speak, and pulling up a column starting at the surface and going deeper and deeper. And if this idea about layers over the earth, if it's consistent over the whole earth, then it ought to be the case that if you create such a column anywhere on the earth, or any two places, you compare them, they ought to be the same. Well, that turned out not to be quite true, because the earth isn't all of one piece. But there was a theory here of great interest. So we have a theory now in geology which can allow us to look out at the world and see it in a new way. And when we see, for example, when we see layers like you see in this picture here, we can begin to understand it as the result, first of all, of a long period of sedimentation, the formation of one horizontal layer on top of another, then followed by a massive transformation in which the entire land had been shifted, uplifted. And so we see here the result, and we see the transformations of time right before our eyes. Geology was important as well because it was made it possible for people to come up with hypotheses as to where they would find resources underground, whether it was iron or copper or coal. Well, in 1859, a very important book was published by Charles Darwin on the origin of species. And in this book, he proposed a new way to understand the origin of species in both the animal world and the vegetable world. He also said at the beginning that a lot of what he had to say is fundamentally known to people who are engaged in animal husbandry or vegetable husbandry. If you are if you breed horses or dogs or any particular animal, you know that you can select those offspring that have a particular characteristic that you like, and if you choose those to be bred for the next generation, typically those characteristics that you prefer, that you like or prefer, will be passed down, and you can push a breed of dog or horse in a particular direction. And he said what's true of breeds is true of species as well. Actually, this is something that revolutionaries in science often do. They come up with a new idea, and they say, well, if you look at this in the right way, what I have to say is something that we've known about a long, long time. Darwin's theory is a theory in two parts. There's variation and selection. Variation involves looking at an organism and its offspring. We see differences there frequently. Some of those differences will then be passed on from the offspring to its offspring. These heritable differences are the only ones that Darwin is concerned with. And his point is that's the origin of all differences that we see within a species and even across species. Because ultimately his theory is that the differences across theories that we see are the accretions of large numbers of changes that fundamentally were built up out of these small, call them small random variations. They're random in the sense that they're not, the direction of their change, the particularity of their change is not determined by, it's not the effect of any particular characteristic that we can identify in the environment. So that's the variation side of the theory. The selection side is equally important, because Darwin's point is here that, of course, not all variation is maintained. The variation that is maintained are those changes, those differences between an organism and its offspring that allow the offspring to be relatively better capable of surviving and thriving in its environment as opposed to all of the other animals, if we're talking about animals, all the other animals that are competing with it for survival in the world in which it lives. That's Darwin's theory. It has a part of variation and a part of selection. In the decades that followed, there were many people who, for some reason or other, wanted to see Darwin's theory as primarily the first part, that is to say, there were many people, and I'm thinking here of Roman Jakobson and Nikolai Trubetskoy, two linguists that we will talk about in Chapter 9. They wanted to see Darwin's theory as a theory essentially of random change. And that's only half of Darwin's theory. We will come back to this in Chapter 9, but bear in mind that Darwin's theory, like any other, can be misunderstood. One of the reasons it's so important to look at Darwin when we're talking about the rise and development of linguistics is that there was a interaction between people talking about the evolution of language and those talking about the evolution of species. Darwin himself was very influenced by the work that linguists had done in the 19th century, looking at how a mother language, so to speak, could split and become several languages. Several generations later, languages could split up and, in effect, turn into different languages due to the accretion of changes over sequences of generations. Another very important idea in 19th century science that have an impact on the way linguistics is done was the discovery, or perhaps you would prefer to say invention, of the periodic table by Dmitri Mendeleev. He published this in 1869 when he was only 35 years old. What he did was come up with a brilliant organization of what was known about elements. Over the preceding decades, chemists had been discovering a number of elements that hadn't been known to the ancients. And it seemed like there were more and more elements being discovered. People had an understanding of what the weight was of each element, what we now call the atomic weight. They didn't have a concept of the atomic number. If you remember how you learned about the periodic table in grade school, you will remember that the weight is determined by the number of protons and neutrons in an atom's nucleus, whereas the atomic number is determined just by the number of protons. But none of that was accessible, intellectually accessible, to anybody in the 19th century. They didn't know about atoms, they didn't know about nuclei, and they didn't know about protons and neutrons. But what Mendeleev was able to do was to find a remarkable structure in which elements could be placed in increasing order of weight, and in which elements that were either similar in terms of their weight, or if they appeared one on top of another in the columns of this periodic table that he created, they could then be similar. He wrote the following: the elements, if arranged according to their atomic weights, exhibit an evident periodicity of properties. Elements which are similar as regards their chemical properties have atomic weights which are either of nearly the same value, for example, platinum, iridium, and osmium, or which increase regularly, for example, potassium, rubidium, and cesium. So increase regularly means that they appear in columns in this table. He wrote, we must expect the discovery of many yet unknown elements, for example, elements analogous to aluminium and silicon, whose atomic weight would be between 65 and 75. And the atomic weight of an element may sometimes be amended by a knowledge of those of the contiguous elements. Thus, the atomic weight of tellurium must lie between 123 and 126 and cannot be 128. This was really an astonishing breakthrough, which combined deep knowledge of the properties, chemical properties and physical properties of the elements, and a belief that this material could be better understood in terms of a structure, a quantitative structure, which lay behind the observations and would ultimately shed great light on the makeup and the organization of the material world in which we live. When Nikolai Trubetskoy began talking about vowel systems and consonant systems and the structures that he found in the inventories of these systems at the very end of the 1920s and in the 1930s, in his work in Vienna, and discussions with the linguists at the Prague Linguistics Circle, this is what people thought of the periodic table of the elements. It seemed like in some fashion Trubetskoy had discovered an organization of sounds in natural languages that was reminiscent of the amazing discoveries of Mendeleev in the middle of the 19th century. This was it was a great surprise, and it was a cause of great excitement. For the rest of this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the rise of linguistics over the course of the 19th century. Well, how to cover nearly 100 years of work in 20 minutes or so? Not possible, but I'll do my best. So let's take a look. What is it that you're seeing here? We've got 3 generations of people that I'm showing you. And if you look here, you'll see a bunch of rectangles, and each rectangle has somebody's name in them. These are linguists, and they include not only the name, but the year in which the person was born and died. If you look at the years here, you'll see that the people on the bottom were born earlier than the people at the top. The people on the bottom form the first generation, and they're born in the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. People in the third generation, you can see here, were born in the 1840s and 1850s. So time is going up. Each of these rectangles represents a person, and I've organized these visually into generations. We'll talk about these generations. Most of the people here, you'll notice, are German. There are some people here who are not German. Rasmus Rask was Danish. William Dwight Whitney, who you've already met, is American. Jan Baudouin de Courtenay was Polish. Ferdinand de Socio was Swiss. Maurice Bloomfield was American. But if I'm not mistaken, everybody else here is German. And if I miss somebody, I'll correct myself on the way out. There was an explosion of interest in what, in retrospect, we could call historical and comparative linguistics towards the beginning of the 19th century. And I don't want to leave the impression that there hadn't been a lot of serious work in the nature of language before this. And I don't want to leave the impression that nobody had thought about the relationship of the languages of Europe before this. Nonetheless, at the beginning of the 19th century, there was really, as I say, an explosion of interest in how the languages of Europe were related to one another. And to some degree, this was triggered by an essay written by William Jones, published in 1788. And we have a tradition on linguistics to point to this essay as having been critical in the development of interest. At this point, let me read to you a very famous sentence from this essay. The Sanskrit language, whatever be its antiquity, is of a wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, and more exquisitely refined than either, yet bearing to both of them a stronger affinity, both in the roots of verbs and in the forms of grammar, than could possibly have been produced by accident. So strong indeed that no philologer could examine them, all three, without believing them to have sprung from some common source, which perhaps no longer exists. And so, in the beginning of the 19th century, a new interest arose. This was studying the history and the relationship among the European languages, determining which ones of them were related and how. Part of this was the result of the possibility for European scholars to study Sanskrit, the ancient language of India. And if we look at these scholars here in what I've called the first generation, we see two of them, von Schlegel and Franz Bopp, who were able to study Sanskrit in Paris. They were able to study with Alexander Hamilton, not our Alexander Hamilton, but a British Alexander Hamilton, who had studied Sanskrit in India and was in Paris for a number of years. They were able to study Sanskrit with him. And being able to study Sanskrit meant that they were able to study Panini as well. Panini was the ancient grammarian of Sanskrit, and his ideas about linguistics, grammatical structure, had an enormous impact on all of the linguistics of the 19th and well into the 20th century. And we can't say enough how influential Panini's work was on Western linguistics. The interest on the part of Europeans was also whetted by the fact that there was a new interest in understanding how the peoples of Western Europe were related to one another, as nations were being founded, as boundaries between countries were being redrawn, and as older empires were torn apart and new countries were being formed. There are four ideas that are central to a lot of the discussion about language that we see in the first generation of linguists. One of them is a conflict between a mechanistic approach to the study of language on the one hand and an organicist approach to language on the other. I'll come back to this. The second is the relation of language and culture. The third is the creation, I would say for the first time, of typologies of languages, that is to say categories into which we can put languages and the way they solve certain problems that we find across languages. And then the fourth is really quite strange from our point of view today, but it's the way in which linguists in the first and indeed in the second generation as well, the linguists look at differences, especially over time, but differences between languages and differences between stages of languages at different times. There's this constant need to decide whether from a moral or from an aesthetic point of view, which is better. And when we're looking at two stages of the same language, this leads to a constant question as to whether a change in a language was an improvement or was it a matter of decline. And this is something that seems so foreign to us today, and yet up until the neo-grammarians in the 1870s, this is just a constant question that linguists kept asking, kept harping on, it seems that we'd say today. And looking back, it's really hard not to see some of this insistence on finding a moral or aesthetic difference in evaluating different languages. It's hard not to see this as related in some fashion either to the colonialism, which was impregnated the view of peoples around the globe that was held by people in Europe, either colonialism or is closely related racism of one sort or another. Well, let's come back to that first point about mechanism, a mechanistic approach in contrast to an organicist approach. When I say a mechanistic approach to science, the easiest thing is to point to the rise of a mechanistic approach to the natural world that you see developed by somebody like René Descartes, for example, in the 1630s and 1640s. And in this regard, he was pretty much in step with other thinkers on the continent. And a mechanistic view of the world saw that what the world consisted of was matter, and that the way to understand how the world evolved was to look at the impact of one object on another, an external impact. You might think of billiard balls, for example, as somehow an example of this kind of impact, or as we think of it today, two molecules in a gas coming together and having an impact one on the other. Organicism is rooted in Aristotle, but at the time we're talking about, the end of the 18th century, the people worth pointing to were Herder and Goethe, leaders in the movement that we refer to today as German Romanticism. And so if mechanism concentrates on the impact between two objects, each external to one another, organicism focuses on an object and its own internal relationship, and focuses less on the relationship between the inside of an object and the world outside it. So organicism looks at an object, whether it's a plant or an animal, and understands where it is at any given moment as the growth or development from an earlier stage. And organicism attempts to find general principles or laws of how an organism goes from an earlier, smaller, and simpler state into a large, later, and more developed state. These principles of growth and development can be stunted, can be in some fashion prevented from reaching their full maturity due to outside forces. But even if an organism is stunted in that way, it still has an end that it's trying to achieve. So organicism includes at its center the idea of teleology, that an organism has a state towards which it's trying to grow and to move. This difference between a mechanistic approach to understanding the world on the one hand and an organicist approach on the other certainly comes down to and evolves into the difference between a behaviorist approach to the use of language by human beings on the one hand and the Chomskyan approach on the other. The behaviorist sees the way to understand the human being as the human being is the state of the human being is the result of the impact of sounds and photons on the outside world, leaving its impression on the human being. The Chomskyan approach is that the language faculty that we see in adults is the internal development of an inherited characteristic with only unimportant differences across people being the result of interaction with the world outside. As I make these recordings, I sometimes go back and listen to them, and occasionally it strikes me that I ought to give a little bit more detail. And that's my impression now as I listen to my comment about the colonialism or perhaps even racism in some of the comments, some of the remarks this first generation makes. I think that deserves a little bit more discussion on my part. So I want to just read with you a little bit from Schlegel. It starts off really interesting, and then it kind of falls apart at a certain point from the point of view of where are these comments coming from. So take a look at chapter 4 here. He's talking about different ways in which words are formed in different languages. And he talks about how in Chinese each word is atomic, and it just sort of sits there without any changes that he's aware of. And then he talks about other languages in which there are affixes, but the affixes just seem to be attached to the stem in a kind of a mechanical way. There aren't any changes. But then there's a system that he really likes where you can see that a suffix has been attached, but there's this reaction on the part of both the stem and the suffix, and there's some kind of change going on as the pieces are put together. Let's take a look at a little bit of what he says here. So we're talking here, this is a chapter on the division of languages into two principal branches founded on its internal structure, meaning structure of words. The peculiar principle dominating in the Indian language and all others derived from it, which means Indo-European languages, will be most intelligibly illustrated by contrast and comparison. In very few languages is the grammar constructed with such astonishing simplicity as the Indian and Greek, the characteristics of which I have attempted to elucidate in the preceding chapter. The features of most other languages are very different, and the laws by which they're governed are of a completely opposite nature. Modifications of meaning or different degrees of signification may be produced either by inflection or internal variation of the primitive word, the basic word, or by annexing to it certain peculiar particles which in themselves indicate the past, the future, or any other circumstance. On these two simple methods, we found our distinction between the two principal branches of language. Every additional difference or variation appears on closer inspection to be nothing more than an inferior modification or secondary consequence of the two grand divisions. Well, inferior, I don't know what that's doing there. Read on a little bit. The Chinese presents a remarkable instance of a language almost without inflection, every necessary modification being expressed by separate monosyllabic words, each having an independent signification. The extraordinary monosyllabic form and perfect simplicity in its construction make the consideration of it important as facilitating the comprehension of other languages. Then he goes on and talks about a few languages. The gradual progress of languages in which this grammatical construction is adopted may probably be traced as follows. In the Chinese, all particles indicating modification of time, person, etc., are monosyllables, perfect in themselves and independent of the root. Perfect. The language of this otherwise refined and civilized people stands consequently in the lowest grade. Where is this coming from? We're evaluating the people and the language, and now there's this big mismatch. It seems possible that the highly artistic system of writing so early introduced may have contributed to the imperfection of the language, seizing it, as it were, in its infancy and fixing its characteristics at too early a stage of their development. There is little beauty in the American dialects. The great number of which has been lamented, as well as the diversity existing between them. There are too many of them, it sounds like he's saying. The dialects of Brazil and Paraguay differing no less widely than those of the Old and New Mexico, and even in the North they are uniform, monotonous, and the similarity of their character clearly indicates a similarity of principle. In the Indian and Greek languages, each root is actually that which bears the signification, and thus seems like a living and productive germ. That sounds like a good thing. Every modification of circumstance or degree being produced by internal changes. You remember we talked about the organicist models. Freer scope is thus given to its development, and its rich productiveness is in truth almost illimitable. From this construction, a language derives richness and fertility on the one hand, and on the other, strength and durability. I think that there's some value judgments coming in here. It may well be said that highly organized even in its origin, it soon becomes woven into a fine artistic tissue, which may be unraveled even after the lapse of centuries. That's historical linguistics. He goes on to talk about some other languages. He writes, those languages, on the contrary, in which the declensions are formed by supplementary particles instead of inflections of the root, have no such bond of union. Their roots present us with no living, productive germ, but seem like an agglomeration of atoms, easily dispersed and scattered by every casual breath. They have no internal connection beyond the purely mechanical adaptation of particles and affixes. These languages, in their earliest origin, are deficient in that living germ essential to a copious development. Their derivations are poor and scanty, and an accumulation of affixes, instead of producing a more highly artistic construction, yields only an unwieldy superabundance of words, inimical to true simple beauty and perspicuity. Its apparent richness is in truth utter poverty. And languages belonging to that branch, whether rude or carefully constructed, are invariably heavy, perplexed, and often singularly subjective and defective in character. We've really lost touch with reality at this point. Then he says, it must not, however, be supposed that I desire to exalt one chief branch of language exclusively to the neglect or disparagement of the other. The sphere of language is too comprehensive, rich, and grand, and has been too highly developed and investigated for one sweeping decision to accomplish any such object. Who can deny the lofty power and energy of the Arabic and Hebraic languages? They indeed stand in the loftiest point of their peculiar branch in respect of construction and development, although their adherence to it is not so exclusive as to prevent their assimilating in some few instances with other family. And then, it must undoubtedly be admitted, after adequate investigation and comparison, that languages in which the grammar is one of inflection are usually preferable as evincing higher art in their construction, but without adducing similar instances from the Greek and Roman, our own noble language, debased and ruined as it is, affords abundant proof of the degradation in which even the most beautiful language may be involved by the negligence of bad writers and the admission of numerous dialects. That's what I had in mind. Interpret it as you will. It is hard to imagine talking about the first generation of linguists in Western Europe in the 19th century without talking about Wilhelm von Humboldt. But in fact, I'm only going to talk about one small aspect of his career, and that is not the linguistics that he did, but rather his involvement in the creation of the modern research university. As you may know, during the Middle Ages, the university system in Western Europe was closely aligned with the Roman Catholic Church. And in this time, in the 18th century, enrollments at universities have been declining precipitously. There were serious financial problems for universities at this point. And after the French Revolution, of course, being a friend of the Catholic Church was not a good thing to be. In 1793, 24 French universities were shut down unilaterally by the revolution, by the government. About 10 years later, when Napoleon invaded Prussia, he in fact invaded and took control of Halle, which was where the major Prussian university was found. The Kaiser wanted to create a new university at that point, and Wilhelm von Humboldt, who worked in the Ministry of Education, was put in charge of this. And Humboldt proposed that henceforth teaching would be valued and viewed as an integral part of doing research. Creating knowledge would be a central mission of professors, which is a radically novel idea. Humboldt himself noted that henceforth science would be viewed as, quote, a problem that has not yet been completely solved and thus remains always in a state of research. The relation between teacher and student is therefore utterly different from what it was in the past. In the past, the teacher was there for the sake of the student, but in the new system, both are there for the sake of Wissenschaft, for the sake of science. This was a model that would come to America with the creation of Johns Hopkins University and Stanford and University of Chicago, and we'll talk about this later on. This conception of the university shared an important feature of its medieval predecessor, which was its autonomy with respect to civil authority. Structurally, the German system was conducive to competition among universities, in part because Germany was not politically unified. Now, if my goal were to cover the major points in Chapter 2 today in this video, I would really be in trouble because there's so much more to talk about, and there's definitely not enough time. But fortunately, that's not my goal. My goal is to talk to you about some of the important things and to encourage you also to go ahead and read the book, give you a sense of what you're going to find, but certainly I'm not talking about all the important things. There's just not enough time. Anyway, let's turn briefly to the second generation of linguists. I have to say something to you about Hermann Grassmann because his name just kind of stands out there. Hermann Grassmann was both a mathematician and a linguist. The work he did in mathematics was extremely important, and he basically created matrix algebra as we know of it today, a lot of linear algebra, and a whole lot more. He didn't write very well, and he didn't make his ideas accessible to other mathematicians. And basically, he was not able to move from the high school mathematics teacher category to that of a university mathematician. And it was very, very frustrating for him. And in retrospect, it seems unfair. In any event, at a certain point, he decided he'd had enough of mathematics, and he decided he was going to go for that other really sexy discipline that was doing really well in Germany, and that was linguistics. So he became a Sanskrit scholar. He created a very important dictionary of Sanskrit, and he discovered what's come to be known as Grassmann's law. And so he had a great career both as a mathematician and as a linguist of Sanskrit. Well, there are other important people here in this second generation. William Dwight Whitney was an American linguist. I've mentioned him a couple of times. In many ways, you read Whitney, and I strongly encourage you to read one of Whitney's books on the nature of language. You can find them for free on the internet, and it sounds so modern. His writing was very influential in Germany, and in many ways the neo-grammarians, who we're coming to in just a minute, who were an important part of the third generation of linguists, in many ways the neo-grammarians started off from the position that they were because they had read the work of William Dwight Whitney. And Max Müller, who was an important linguist in the second generation as well, he's actually probably better known today as the inventor of the academic discipline of the history of religion, and his communications with Charles Darwin were very important as well. Let's move on to the third generation. Well, actually, before I say that, let me point out one of the characteristics that made the second generation what it was that unlike the first generation, the second generation had linguistic literature to read. They were able to read the materials, the books that the first generation wrote, and that made for a huge difference. So the first generation was primarily doing its work sort of straight from the data. The second generation had the publications of the first generation to read. The third generation was now deeply embedded in German academic structure. And what we had for the first time was an internal struggle within the discipline. And the young people who were part of this new movement have come to be known as the neo-grammarians or the Jungrammatiker. Not going to say much about them then. Important movement. We discuss this in chapter 2 of the book. What I'd rather do is just say a little bit about Ferdinand de Socio, a really important linguist, and also Jan Baudouin de Courtenay, who basically created modern phonology. I can't say that he's not given credit for that today, but he's still not all that well known as a linguist, and the importance of his work is not perhaps widely recognized. So I'd like to spend a minute or two on the importance of his work, and that'll draw to a close our discussion of Chapter 2. Here's a diagram from Chapter 2 that tells you more than you want to know at this point about Baudouin de Courtenay. But about Baudouin de Courtenay, I'd like to say one or two things. He was very clear on the first two principles that define contemporary phonology. The first is a principle that goes back hundreds of years, goes back to almost anybody who's tried to construct a writing system for a natural language. And it's the principle of the phoneme, which is to say that in a human language, there are typically a small number, between, let's say, 12 and 60 or so, sounds, which can be used to mark contrast between different words. So we've got, and we call these phonemes. So given a pair of words that are, from a sound point of view, different, we can identify at least two sounds that are different phonemes and which serve to make the difference in pronunciation a legitimate difference in a particular language. A difference from a sound point of view in a language will always be reducible to differences between pairs of phonemes. The second principle, however, Baudouin de Courtenay was clear on, and people before him weren't clear on this, and that is when you look at alternations, there are two different kinds. So an alternation means finding pairs of words typically. It may be pairs of forms in a more general sense, but let's say pairs of words that differ in identifiable pairs of sounds. In some cases, those pairs of sounds can be explained by the sounds in their context. In other cases, they cannot. I'm going to make my example out of American English. So in American English, we've got a difference between the sounds T as in T and the pronunciation that we call a flap, the pronunciation of T in a word like in a word such as Italy. So that pronunciation of the T in Italy is a flap. It's a r. By contrast, in the word Italian, there's not a flap there. It's not r. It's not Italian, but there's a T, and we say Italian. So we've got these two related words, Italy and Italian, and we've got a T in one case in Italian and a R in the other in Italy. The choice of the one or the other, of the flap in the one case and the T in the other, is entirely determined by the stress on the vowels that are immediately adjacent to the T in either case. So in Italy, the stress is on an immediately preceding vowel, and the following vowel is unstressed. Whereas in Italian, the preceding vowel is unstressed, the following vowel is stressed, Italian. And so it's the environment that determines, you might say in a mechanical way, in an automatic way, which pronunciation is which sound is chosen. Okay, so that's one kind of alternation that we find. Another kind of alternation is in pairs of words like sing and sang, where we've got two words that are obviously related. In sing, we've got an I. In sang, we've got an a. And there's nothing in the environment that will explain the difference between those two, why it's I in one case and a in the other. The environments of the two are identical. There's an S before them and an ing, the ng sound, following them. So it's not the environment that determines it. It's rather something, in this case grammatical. It has to do with the tense of the verbs sing and sang. So these are two very different aspects of phonology, and it was Baudouin de Courtenay who was really clear on this point. I might add that not all theories of phonology treat these two cases as fundamentally and qualitatively different. Classical generative phonology, for example, does not. And any theory of phonology that comes around the bend has to be interrogated and evaluated with respect to how well it deals with the difference between these two kinds of phonology. Let's end our discussion of Chapter 2 with Ferdinand de Socio. Socio was a Swiss linguist who studied in Leipzig, which was the center of Western European linguistics when he was a young man. He was very interested in Indo-European. And I didn't tell you very much about the neo-grammarians before. I thought I could skip over it, but no way. Let's just quickly review what it meant to study Indo-European. At the beginning with the first generation of Indo-Europeanists, people started by finding corresponding sounds in related languages. They could find that there were lots of words in such pairs of languages which corresponded one to another. Take case of a word in English that begins with an H, which could correspond to a word in Latin, for example, that begins with the sound k. So we've got hound in English and canis in Latin, and we've got 100 in English and centum in Latin. We've got just bunches of large numbers of words where we've got a h corresponding in English corresponding to a k in Latin. Another great example is hemp, cannabis. Same original word. So we've got these correspondences between sounds. As Indo-European studies went further, the goal became not just to find correspondences, but rather to determine what the parent sound was out of which these two or more contemporary sounds evolved. So we reconstruct an earlier sound, and what that means is then we come up with laws or statements, principles, which account for the change from the posited earlier sound to the observed sound today. Once you do that, then the challenge, the task of reconstructing Indo-European becomes very complicated, because with each sound change that is posited, which is discovered and thereby posited, the question becomes, how do these sound changes relate to one another? Typically, they won't happen at the same time. Conceivably, it's possible, but most of the time we'll be discovering sound changes. They're in some kind of chronological order, one with respect to another. What is that order? And to what group of languages did any particular sound change apply? And once you start asking questions like this, Indo-European reconstruction becomes a really difficult and absolutely fascinating scientific endeavor. So by the time we get to the neo-grammarians in the 1870s, this becomes a real complicated science, and the neo-grammarians insisted on utter rigor with respect to the formal properties of the sound changes that were being posited. And Socio himself was really terrific at this, and he proposed in a work that he wrote when he was barely 20 years old. He reconstructed a vowel system for Indo-European, which just amazed everybody. So his career continued, but he had a difficult time as a linguist. Although people were very impressed with his work, he had difficulty writing papers and publishing. And around the middle of his career, he left Paris, which was, for a francophone, the greatest place for a linguist to work, and he went back to Geneva, where his family was from. And for the last dozen years of his life, he worked there, and he was not very happy with what he had accomplished in his life. And in the last couple of years, he taught a course on general linguistics. And after he died, some of his students and colleagues got together their notes of what Socio had said in those lectures, and they published a book which became a great classic, maybe the greatest classic in all of linguistics. It's the Cours de Linguistique Générale, the course in general linguistics. And that's the Socio that is mostly remembered today. And there's so many things that he tried to do in this book. And in the last 20 years, a number of his notebooks have been published, which give us a better idea of where his thought was going. I'm only going to mention one or two of the important ideas that are adumbrated and in some cases developed in his work. Perhaps the most important was the contrast between diachronic and synchronic linguistics. And he made the case for the importance of studying languages synchronically. So a synchronic analysis of a language is the analysis by a linguist of a language at a particular moment in time, a snapshot, you might say. And a diachronic analysis was what most linguists had done over the course of the 19th century, which was to look at the evolution of languages over time and look at the relationships between related languages. And Socio was one of those who pointed out the importance of understanding languages at a particular moment in time. Socio's work was published, was recognized after he died, but it was really in the 1930s when Roman Jakobson, who we'll get to when we get to chapter 9, went back and identified Socio as a classic figure to to which he and others could point as a person who had made clear what it was that linguists were going to be doing in the first 30, even 40 years of the 20th century. All right, so I've done it. It's taken me longer than I expected, but I've given you some of the more important points that we discussed in Chapter 2 of Battle in the Minefield. I hope if you're interested in this, you'll take a look at the chapter and read it and find all the things that I didn't talk to you about in this video. See you next time for Chapter 3.